I always love this recording in progress sound. It's just really intimidating. So, hello and welcome to the second event of New Media in Contemporary Culture events. And today we have an amazing guest, another amazing guest in the series. I'm so happy. I'm so pleased that we have Lyle Skains right from Bangor with us today. So by the end of introduction, let me read the bio. So Dr. Lyle Skains conducts a practice-based research into writing, reading, playing, publishing digital and transmedia narratives. Her recent digital fiction, including the No World for Tomorrow and Only Always Never, can be found at lyleskains.com. She founded Wonderbox Digital, a marketplace for digital fiction aiming to explore innovations in digital and online publishing and creativity. She's also the organizer of the annual New Media Writing Prize and an editor on the Electronic Literature Collection, Volume 4. Her latest book is on the popular emergence of digital fiction, available from Bloomsbury. Lyle, how are you today?
I'm good. How are y'all?
Oh, I think we just fine. Okay, so the floor is yours, Lyle. Lyle, are you there? Are we there? And am I there? Oh, I just love it. It happens right now at the perfect time. Hello? There you go. You know, just on the beginning of this. I love it. I think it.
There we are. I don't have audio from you yet.
Sorry.
There you are.
I don't know what just happened. Nobody knows. But I'm back.
Such is life.
Okay. So, Lyle, again, the floor is yours. I hope nothing will happen anymore. So, we are all ears now.
Okay, grand. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be here. I feel quite honored to be amongst such illustrious company amongst your speakers. So I'm quite enjoying that. So let me just bring up slides.
Lyle, no problem. Absolutely. No problem. That's our pleasure, I'm sure.
All right. So, I titled this it apparently wants to go through. It was on autoplay. So I titled this the digital fiction of inequality, and I probably should have titled it the digital fiction of equality. But we're just going to go with it, and talk about a little bit about using digital fiction as a bit of a case study, and looking at how it has historically emerged around the world in different forms based on different pressures that are placed on it. And we can see how this notion of the post-digital is not really applicable if we're talking on a global scale or an equality scale. And I will give a shameless plug. This is part of the book that I just published with Bloomsbury. I did want to point out that if you want the slides, they are available on this link. And you can scan the QR code if you have a mobile device. So feel free to have a look at that, and that'll include references and things like that. So yeah, the book is Never Ending Stories. Please order for your libraries. It's not cheap, as academic books never are, but there is a discount, and the material that I'm talking about today is included in the book. So it's not without further detail and discussion. So I kind of start off from this perspective and this platform, that there's, like many areas in terms of research and knowledge and art, there is definitely imperialism in electronic literature. I like this image of the United States sort of being the center of the universe. And for a long time, that's essentially how the study of electronic literature was. It was very focused on English language, and the traditions that have come out of English language computing, English language gaming, English language programming, and literary traditions. And a lot of the focus has been on the text itself and the potentiality of interaction. So it's this new criticism approach to it as literature. And so it's this very much bounded in this Anglo-American approach to literature. But what's important to remember is that other forms and practices have definitely emerged that are based on the actual interactions and relationships between the text and the designer and the reader. The text doesn't emerge in some cases unless the designer and the reader get together and collaborate. So it isn't this sort of one to text to one interaction that we're talking about. Sometimes the text is not the primary outcome. Sometimes it's the discourse and the interaction between the people involved. We're going to look at a few of those here. So thinking about digital fiction, we have lots of different definitions, most of which were created by people in the Zoom room, Alice and Astrid and Dave Chicarico and Marie-Laure Ryan, who isn't in the Zoom room, so I do draw upon those definitions, the ideas of born digital literature, that it needs a digital device in some way to have its full effect, to actually be fully realized. And I'm focusing on three elements here that are afforded by digital media, in particular for narratives. And these are participation, interactivity, and multimedia. And you'll see why I kind of broaden this definition a little bit when we start talking about the different types of digital fiction that have evolved in different places due to different evolutionary pressures. So participation is really about the reader player getting involved. So there's this notion, right? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, did it really fall? And that's kind of the idea, is if a narrative, if a book stays in the library and it never gets pulled off the shelf and it's never opened, does it actually exist? And we can think about that in terms of digital fiction. If no one clicks a link, if no one plays that video, if no one instantiates it, the narrative doesn't exist. This is particularly true for digital fiction, which really needs that reader, player, or reader in the sorry, it's morning here and I can't think of it's right on the tip of my tongue. Landau, as Landau coined, which instantiates the actual instance of that narrative, the sujet or discourse. And so it requires that element for the narrative to actually exist, not just in an ontological sense, but in an actualized sense, in that many digital fictions are different in each instantiation. So there's a performative aspect there. Interactivity is more closely aligned to the unique features of digital fiction that we discuss, such as these branching and different network structures that Marie-Laure Ryan has outlined in this figure here. Multiple potential actualizations or sujets or discourses of the narrative. personalized narratives where they can become customized based on what the reader player does, and repeat readings as standard. When we think about other narrative media such as film or novel or television or stage play, or even oral storytelling sometimes to a certain degree, repeat readings are part of it, right? We all rewatch favorite films or reread novels, but but it's not standard to necessarily get to the end of a novel and immediately turn back to page 1 and read it again, or get to the end of the film and rewind it if you're from the old school where we used to have videotapes, or take it back to the beginning and play it again. But with digital fiction, that sort of interactivity is standard. You frequently get to the end of a story game or narrative or hypertext and go back to the beginning and find your way through another path, another instantiation. And then, of course, multimedia. And this is, yes, multimedia in the sense of multiple media modes within the same text. But of course, we have that throughout most of our narrative media. Film is multimedia. Stage plays are multimedia. Even novels, thinking about the fact that we have visual aspects and the font and the colors and those sorts of things and how it's spaced. But also within digital fiction, we have properties that affect the narrative, like semiotic channels, sensory channels, spatiotemporal and kinetic, but also just the mere fact that we're inviting participation. That command line, which is illustrated here, or the hyperlink, in and of themselves, if there's nothing else multimedia in the piece, represent multiple media. There's multiple properties there that are affecting the narrative in addition to that one particular communication mode that may be present. So in terms of digital fiction, thinking about evolutionary pressures that get placed on it, and affect how it develops in different locations, in different cultures, in different languages. This is the sort of narrow list that I've come up with based on the emergence of different traditions around the world. Technology and access is a big one, and I'm going to talk more about that. I'm going to talk more about each of these as we look at different forms of digital fiction that have emerged. Existing narrative media, in particular oral narrative traditions, whether or not digital fiction really persists and is supported and evolves often comes down to education structures and cultural values and structures. Languages and alphabets have played a major role. We tend to, as literature scholars or creative writers, we don't think that much about how language and alphabets can affect digital fiction's development, but it certainly does, because there's the added element of programming, which is done in languages. Sociopolitical climates and governments definitely have a role, as well as commerciality and capitalism. We're used to, in the West, thinking of electronic literature and digital fiction as not necessarily commercial properties. They've historically been mostly experimental or academic or art-based or avant-garde. But in many places around the world, that is absolutely not the case. They absolutely play a role and are part of a major aspect of national commerciality and the economy. So thinking about English language scholarship of digital fiction, quite often in the literature, we focus on the technology as the defamiliarization mechanism, right? We have our literature traditions that and what is different about digital fiction to us in the English language scholarship is the technology, not other aspects. We're really focused on technology because we're really focused on text. But this is based on an assumption of that everyone else is like us, that all other, that essentially global culture is monolithic in terms of culture, politics, and language, and that's just not the case. And so it's helpful to, again, widen our perspective on what goes into creating and reading or playing digital fiction. Okay. So oral storytelling is and traditions of oral storytelling are actually really important to digital fiction. Digital fiction, as you know, Walter Ong talks about a secondary orality, that we've really clicked into that notion of secondary orality with things like social media and Web 2.0, this discursive web. And it's important to remember that oral storytelling and digital fiction have so much in common. It's not necessarily something that the technology has introduced, more that it has afforded us to better remediate a form of storytelling that we've always done. So oral storytelling is multicursal. It goes in different directions, sometimes very confusingly, depending on who you might be listening to. But other times, this is part of audience participation, asking questions, directing the storyteller to where it's going to go, part of dialogue and dialect. Oral storytelling is multimodal. It can involve performance and dance and props and music and other elements such as that. Definite textual metalepsis, as we go in and out of the story. Is the storyteller part of the story? Are they outside of the story? Are the audience part of the story? We drift between story levels and story worlds? They're very traditionally personalized, right? There are localizations. If we think back to the Jongleur traditions and the sort of bardic traditions where storytellers were mobile, they would personalize their stories to whatever patron they might have been, whoever was hosting them at the moment, or to the audience, that sort of thing. And definitely each performance and each telling is unique, just as digital fiction is. And so this performativity and all of these techniques that we develop works well in digital media as well. So it's accessible, and it's something that we're just reshaping through the technology, not that has been sort of created by new technology. And this is something that's really important to remember. Access to tech and digital literacy is a significant factor in how and where digital fiction emerges. So in 1996, as we're sort of at the peak of things like interactive fiction, text adventure games, graphic adventure games, right? We're about to have this major branch between where we've already started developing hypertext in the US. But that's when about 16% of the US population was online, whereas the rest of the world, only 0.1% of the population was online. So when we talk about early digital fiction and early technologies being very American centric, well, it's because they were. It's because that's the only place that had the technology in sufficient enough numbers and distribution to actually do anything with it. By 2017, however, much of the world, and you'll note that this is the developed world, that 70% plus, lots of these places were at 80 to 90% saturation of North America, Europe, Australia, South Korea, Malaysia, Chile, Argentina. They're online. So we've got some element of access to the internet in these countries. Whereas China and India, right, with their huge populations, only 54% of the Chinese population was online, only 30% of India. And if we look to West, Central, and Eastern Africa, it's much, much lower, less than 15%. So yes, much of digital fiction's history is driven by these historical European, North American, English language and Western language influenced traditions, although we're going to see some differences in Japan and South Korea. But by and large, it's because a lot of the world population just wasn't online and isn't online. And even as recently as 2019, only less than half of global households have access to a computer and internet at the same time. And if you don't have access to a computer, it's very difficult to create the type of digital fiction that we have focused on in Anglo-American context and European context, because mobile devices are largely consumer devices. You can create in terms of social media, but there are lots of limitations placed on the type of story, the type of narrative, the type of publication that you can put into social media. It's very much framed by the platform that you're on and the device that you're on. Whereas with a computer, you can dive fully into programming and HTML and all these sorts of things that we've been doing. Those of us with heavy saturation in terms of computer and internet access have been doing for a long time. So it's really important to remember that if you don't have access to the basic digital technology of digital fiction, electronic literature, you're not going to develop it. Educational structures, and I like this image here because it is this nice clean image of a classroom, but it's also an image of conformity and uniformity and conservatism and authoritarianism, right? All the desks are in line in neat rows, easily countable, orderly. They're all facing forward, facing an unseen teacher who is going to be the authority of knowledge and delivering it to these students. So our education structures are very sort of imperialist, as it were. And so what we see in terms of their effect on digital fiction is that this conservatism in these different fields, in language studies, in literary studies, it's providing barriers to digital fiction. We've definitely seen it affect traditions of electronic literature and avant-garde art and avant-garde literature and works by people from marginalized communities like women and people of color and migrants, religious minorities, that sort of thing. In most of our linguistic traditions and literary traditions, in the UK, in the US, in China, in Germany, in Romania, there's these digital fiction starts to bud, starts to pop out, and then things like English departments go, oh no, this isn't literature. Go away. You can go study in this broom closet. No, you can't teach this to your students. No, this isn't going to become part of our elementary and our primary and secondary school curricula. And although France is an outlier, as they often are, because they embraced computer-driven media as part of the avant-garde tradition for which they're frequently known, and as an extension of the Oulipo movement and that sort of thing. Particularly, we also see it in locations influenced by European colonialism. So you see a lot of conservatism in places like India, where they've still got this sort of orderly authoritarian structure now built into their own infrastructures and cultures that may not have been there if they hadn't been subject to European colonization. So changing tack a little bit, I'm going to start with looking at the different aspects of digital fiction that we've seen emerge. And this is sort of the very American Western-centric emergence of digital fiction, not because that's the most important, but because it's the earliest. As we saw, this sort of computer activity and programming emerges in the States Although we do see some very early things like e-poetry, even earlier than this in 1959 in Germany, and indeed Poland. But in terms of digital fiction, not necessarily poetry, the first that we can really identify based on the literature is Addis and McKay's The Sumerian Game. Mabel Addis was a school teacher, and IBM put out an ad for people to propose interesting ideas for the use of their new emerging computers as they're trying to, post World War II, to sell them to businesses and schools and things like that. And so they created this. The Sumerian Game was the very first civilization simulator. It was meant to educate about the Sumerian civilization. And so you can see a girl playing it there. You would put in commands and everything would, you didn't have a monitor at that time. It was a printer. So everything would print out on the printer. We have the Oregon Trail, which is much beloved of the Gen X and millennial Americans, as it was taught in many, many schools, which had a similar evolution, innovation, in that it was created by people who were teaching and had some programming hobbies, and were roommates. And so they said, oh, we wanted to do something different. We were a bit bored. And they created the Oregon Trail in the early 70s. And then we quite often point to Colossal Cave Adventure, which Will Crowther programmed initially as a personal project, and then it went out on the burgeoning internet at that time, which was the ARPANET, and later other people picked it up, and another programmer named Don Woods decided to add some things like scoring and multiple endings and things like that that were more game-like. And this was so extraordinarily popular amongst things like students who were in computer programs and computer science programs, and the different pockets where computing was quite heavily used, that a team of MIT graduates.
Yeah, sorry about that.
All right, I paused it. It's fine.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening these days. It's like terrible. I'm sorry again. Okay, let's keep on.
No worries. No worries at all. All right, I was on Uncle Roger. So Uncle Roger is one of those pre World Wide Web hypertext. Judy Malloy was so excited by digital media that she created what she called a database narrative. And she built a narrative through a databasing system that she created, and then shared it through bulletin board sites and different news groups and things like that. So we do see that sort of excitement with the new technology in that tradition. And then the Portopia serial murder case, which is a Japanese, the sort of the first Japanese visual novel, emerges because its author read about text adventure games. They weren't translated, they didn't make it over to Japan, but he read about them in a magazine and decided to create his own. And then we have things like Eastgate, the hypertext publisher, emerging as in a very literary, literature-based model, which was successful amongst its circle for a while, but didn't quite emerge onto the stage in terms of publishing overall. So Western, and as we see other elements to develop beyond what we sort of recognize and get cited over and over and over, we do see traditions emerging in Western, and this is North America, South America, Europe, in France and in French and Portuguese languages. It's mostly experimental, avant-garde. In Poland, actually, we see a very large and rich tradition with electronic literature and digital fiction, with the digital magazine or zine Texty, which was started in, I think, 2001, 2002, and remains to this day. I am not going to attempt to pronounce anyone's names in this because there are names from many different languages and I am terrible with them. So we see a hypertext novel was printed, it was published, sorry, in print in 1991 and 1996, and I wouldn't even know how to pronounce it. AE, I always say it AE in my brain, but that's not it. There's a name for that letter, and I'm sure Astrid is screaming at her screen right now telling me what it is. But since I've only ever seen it in print, that's what it is. We see My Boyfriend Come Back from the War that emerges from Russian language. And there's some sort of self-published type stuff that goes on the RuNet, in the forms of like what we would think of as like fan fiction type tradition of sharing work and collaborating on works. Germany does develop an early electronic literature practice in some early e-poetry, but it definitely got stamped out through educational conservatism and that cultural conservatism that's holding on to the traditional structures of literature and that sort of thing, and it didn't get promoted in German language through Germany and Austria and Switzerland, the places that speak German. It just didn't catch hold with the powers that be, as it were. We see a quite a good tradition emerging in Spanish language locations, which evolved from these oral traditions and collective novels, right? We've always had this sort of embrace of literature as a political movement, nationalist concerns, artistic experimentation. So a number of works emerge from Colombia, from Argentina, right? Argentina, which is following the tradition of Jorge Luis Borges with his ideas about forking paths, which we see as an antecedent to branching structures. Juan Gutierrez, Blas Valdez, Jaime Rodriguez. We see lots of different works emerging from Spanish language to this day. So it's dependent here upon culture, upon those educational pressures, and to a certain extent, especially when we start to talk about Slavic languages and languages that use Cyrillic alphabet, you have the difficulty of programming again, in that most of the programming languages that are emerging and the traditions that are emerging in digital fiction are English language and Roman alphabet based. So there is an element of that alphabetic issue with digital fiction in Arabic. We don't see much in digital fiction emerge in the Arab world. And remember that the Arab world, it's kind of glomming a lot of very variable cultures and highly different socioeconomic situations, right, from North Africa to the Middle East. So you have some countries that are very, very wealthy and have extremely high proliferation of digital technology, and then some in which it's very slow and very low. And the only thing that's binding these places together is language in some cases. So the first interactive novel we pinpoint at Zilal Awad, One's Own Shadows, in 2001, and very little emerged. There's more coming out now with Ram Hosni's work and with things like Dictionary of the Revolution, which focused on elements of the Arab Spring, and why it doesn't emerge more in especially places where there's high proliferation of tech. It's difficult. The Arabic alphabet obviously is very different from the Roman alphabet, and there's also a direction of language. So programming situations initially wouldn't have been highly conducive to that sort of translation. And also many of these countries have a minority English speakers. There's not a lot of proliferation of English either. So you have less influence from works that are coming in, or traditions or things that are popular in English speaking areas of the world. In other places around Africa, West, Central, Southern, Eastern Africa, Kwabena Opoku Agyemang, who I do know, but I'm terrible with his name, identifies Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Tanzania, and Ghana as places with vibrant digital literature, but it's very different from what we think of in the Western sphere as digital fiction or electronic literature. So here we're seeing oral traditions sort of hop over print culture and go straight into digital media. And what's happened here is a lack of access to that sort of creatorly tech, the computers, the laptops, the dedicated internet, it doesn't happen. As we saw in previous slide, there's less than 15% of the population of these countries is online. What they do have is mobile devices, and in many places, internet provided by social media companies. So Facebook provides the internet connection for some places. They have developed and installed the infrastructure. And so Facebook is actually how many of these people access the internet. And so we're seeing these oral traditions, like the Akpos jokes, which are sort of trickster jokes, trickster stories, emerge in things like webtoons and shared on social media. Jungle Jim is an old comic element that has been that was produced as a digital zine and shared on social media. Diary of a Zulu Girl was a blog fiction that was shared. They call them M novels, which is these sort of serialized novels that come out in chunks for reading on your mobile device. And we actually see that emerge in several locations. So this heavy use of a mobile device means that a lot of people aren't able to do some of the technological fireworks that people in with strong histories of access to computers have, such as the text adventure games and the hypertext and the database fictions and Flash stories and that sort of thing. They're skipping and they're just going to things where they can input text, maybe incorporate images, audio, whatever they can do within the structures of social media. That's where they're putting their stories into digital fiction. And so they wind up having a lot of dialectic type work where they have a lot more interaction with their readers, their audiences, as they're creating a work. So it isn't this, I'm going to sit and create a text and have it perfected, and then I'm going to give it to you and you can experience it, and it doesn't matter if I'm there or not, right? The death of the author. In these works, much like oral storytelling, the author is still there and is still participating, is still shaping the story as they're being shared and as it's going around, and it's part of this collective participatory tradition that becomes interactive through the story and through the text. India is an interesting case in that, like many cultures, it has a strong oral narrative tradition, and we can see that there are some amazing multimodal and multicursal methods of narrative storytelling in the rich culture that goes far back into ancient history with Indian culture. There's Katha stories, oral stories. There's the Dastangoi Urdu tradition, which is sort of performative collective storytelling. So there's an image there of a story, a Dastangai group, a collective. The Patachitra, which are narrative scroll paintings, kind of like tapestries, the way that we would form like the Bayeux tapestry, stories and tales and histories in these paintings. The Gita Govinda, which is epic poetry and performance, so this sort of performative aspect again of storytelling. and Chitrakavi, which is Tamil picture poetry, which I really love. So it's this image that then has text woven in, much like concrete poetry that develops, but the image itself is drawn on with text rather than drawn by the text. So in terms of digital fiction that we see emerging, it's slow because that 7 million internet users looks really high, but then you think about it, oh, that's actually only about 30% of India. And so India has had a struggle with technological access being and inconsistent technological access and infrastructure throughout. So much of the tradition that we see there is coming out in social media fiction, like the Western and Eastern and Southern African nations. So we see things like the Cloakroom in 2004, which was a little bit blog, a little bit cell phone novel, and the blog came out and then it would sort of ping to cell phones. And then there is a developing tradition of indie games. Lots of game development is happening in India, and so we see Studio Olio Mingus' Walking Sim Somewhere, which is highly popular. And so these little pockets of digital fiction are emerging from this sort of very vibrant oral storytelling culture. Chinese digital fiction is a really interesting case in that right, we have a large amount of population. Even if only 50% of the Chinese population is online, that's still millions and, well, billions of people actually. And so that's a lot of people in the Chinese language that could be creating, but we do have some barricades. Their alphabet being so distinct from the Roman alphabet and other alphabets that were used in programming really stunted creativity in Chinese language for quite a while. And it wasn't until students who were actually studying in America sort of created their own Chinese-based programming languages that you have the ability to program in their native language. There are restrictions on how you can access the internet and how you can use it. So whereas we're used to, in Western context, we've been used to, go online, get your own website, right? We had GeoCities, we had NeoCities, we had our own domains. So it's very easy to get your own website. In fact, you can just buy them like crazy. They're cheap. There's no restrictions on who can access them, who can use them. And so we can create whatever we want. But in China, that's not the case. It's actually very difficult to get your own website. And so much of the access that people have and in terms of creativity is through social media like sites. And then there are also, so we see also in such as in the Spanish language tradition where digital fiction and these sorts of experimental forms are used as commentary, as political movement, as this effort to improve the world and to speak to power. Well, in China, in communist China, this isn't a thing that happens. There are significant speech restrictions. So there's limitations on what they can do in their creative work. And so it's driven largely by personal creative desires and this tradition in Chinese literature to be fanciful. Chinese literature doesn't make a distinction between realism and fantasy. In fact, it's not really considered literature unless it has elements of fantasy and magic and that sort of thing woven in it. And so in some ways that has helped to develop some elements of digital fiction in Chinese language. So what we see is what they call Wangluo Wenxiu, which I'm sorry, that's terrible. I should not try to pronounce anything, which is internet literature. And I've it's very similar to Wattpad. In fact, Wattpad was developed from the Chinese internet literature tradition, which is people go, onto these social media sites that are a little bit like Reddit, a little bit like Facebook, a little bit like forums and bulletin boards, and they start creating stories, and they write their stories, and like fan fiction, they interact with their audiences, they get feedback, they get reactions, they build them into these novels that then are sold in bookstores. There are huge sections of internet literature sold in bookstores around China. And so it's a massive commercial field in China. So and almost half of the people who access the internet in China, at least in 2014, engaged somehow in these web novels, this internet literature. And so we see this emerge, very popular works in 1998 and 2000. These were massive hits and well known. And so there's this huge tradition of internet literature, both in terms of what we would call amateur or internet gift economy, where you're trading for free online, but then also publishing as novels in bookstores. In Japan, obviously, we don't have the same speech and internet restrictions that we have in China, but we also don't have the English language as a base, and we have obviously a kanji alphabet. So the text adventure games and things like that are emerging in Europe and in North America, they're reading about them, they're hearing about them, but they can't use them directly. So Yuji Horii creates the Portopia serial murder case as his interpretation of a text adventure game, as he read about it in a magazine. And so that launches the visual novels. And by 2006, visual novels account for almost 70% of all PC games in Japan. It's a huge market. They're often sort of interpersonal and romance based. They are sometimes called dating sims. And so it's all these, you see a girl, do you walk up and talk to her, yes or no, that sort of thing. So there's these romance stories, and then of course there's erotica stories and things like that. In addition, they do have M novels or cell phone novels, or thumb novels or ketai shosetsu, that we see in later emergence in Africa and China, in Africa, where because of long commutes and early access to mobile phones, it's nice to have something to read while you're on your commute. And so these and visual novels were so big in Japan that they have since sort of evolved back into English language games. So we do see traditions of visual novels very much taking on an anime style, very much influenced by Japanese literary culture and media culture, come back into Western digital fiction. Korean digital fiction, in addition to having things like the cell phone novels and the visual novels that Japan has, one of the big elements and one of the unique things that they have developed are these webtoons. And unlike here, where we think of web comics as, a comics artist, produces their work online and releases it, and they get revenue from ads or subscriptions or what have you. Webtoons are actually part of huge transmedia story worlds, much in this, they're the Marvel of South Korean media. So the Marvel story world with comics and games and TV and all this sort of stuff, and films, obviously. This is the world in which digital fiction and webtoons participate in Korea. And they're interactive, they're transmedia, they're optimized for mobile devices. So you can see on the left here, that's just the first screen really that I could fit onto a computer screen, but you would just keep scrolling downward to see more of the webtoon. And so it's incorporating, and it may incorporate interactive and multimedia elements. and it's a huge national industry. So the government recognizes it as a significant art form, a significant media form, and provides large amounts of financial and legal support. So it's very much embraced by the culture here, and the affordances of media. And right, South Korea also is very well known for mobile devices and sort of ubiquitous internet access. So this question of post-digitality, it's very difficult to say that we're post-digital, right? That notion that we're so digital that it's saturated, that we don't even notice it anymore, that it's just part of our lives the same way that indoor plumbing is part of our lives. But it's very difficult to say that when we can still see statistics like this, when we know that great swaths of the global population don't have digital access. If they do have access or infrastructure, they might not have literacy. And is it truly post-digital if you're merely a consumer, which is what most mobile devices and tablets push us into being, right? Particularly Apple devices are very locked down. It's very difficult to create on those, and it's very centered on this curated experience. And even on other devices and platforms, it's still difficult. The space of creating anything on mobile devices is very limited, especially if you don't already have that knowledge from working on larger machines. And so as we look at this and we see how much of our world doesn't have a mobile phone, doesn't have the internet, doesn't have that capability to create, to truly make use of the devices that we think of as ubiquitous, can we be post-digital? Can we say that? Or are we once again being very narrow focused and limiting our perspective to our own geographical and political and socioeconomic frame? And so it's something to think about, particularly as we start to move very heavily in our spheres into things like virtual reality and augmented reality, to think that we're just skipping and hopping past all of these issues, and starting to spread the gap between traditions and narrative practices in different locations. And that is everything. So thank you very much. I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to chat.
Great. Lyle, thank you. Thank you very much for this amazing and fascinating talk. I, as a electronic digital fiction scholar, had no idea about this vibrant digital fiction life in outside of Europe and the States. So that was for me a big discovery then.
It's very
Okay.
difficult because, you know, if there's scholarship on it, it's in languages that we might not be able to speak or read. And so we're reliant upon the few scholars who are able to work in multiple languages and share their scholarship with us.
Yeah, true that. Okay. So let's open this session for questions. So anybody, anything to say or comment on?
Nope, it was all super clear. Everyone accepts all my ideas as gospel, and
so if I may open the discussion, because I am into a particular branch or subgenre of digital fiction, what I call app fiction. My question is about these cell phone novels, not cell phone fiction. Would you do you know what kind of cell phone fiction it is or was? Was it also an app downloadable on a mobile device, or was it a specific dedicated web page hosted by, for example, Google, which is known for such practices, or maybe some local websites? Are you familiar with the, let's say, software and hardware of these projects?
Yeah. So in Africa, the Yoku or the Yozu, sorry, the Yozu stories, it was a particular app, and it doesn't exist any longer, but it was, and so it was a platform where people could it was a little bit like a publisher. And then in China, it's mostly through websites, and they originally were sort of social media-y, like Reddit type sites. And then with the popularity of internet literature, there are specific sites now for internet literature, like Banyan Tree, things like that. The links are in the chapter. They're not in the presentation, but where possible, I've included the URLs in the chapter. In Japan, it's usually a specific site where people go. There may be some app platforms proliferating. Again, there's no restrictions really on how they can do it. But websites are quite popular because they're device independent. So I think that's helpful to dissemination. And then in Korea, they're very much made and hosted on the owners of the media property. So it would be like Marvel produces these and they're on their website. So there's a couple of main platforms for webtoons and transmedia narratives in South Korea where they host these.
All right, thank you very much. Anybody else? All right, a question from Astrid.
Hi, Astrid.
Hello. First of all, thank you for this fascinating overview, Lyle. I now work in an area studies department, and I'm constantly, thinking about how we might take digital fiction into a more sort of comparatistic, but not comparative thing, because it's comparatistic. Exercises tend to be, or can be, quite limiting. They can also be quite colonial, and so I'm always a little bit torn, right? So am I going to tell people what happens in Africa, what happens in Japan, or is this just completely reductionist and essentialist in a way? Can I even talk about it, right? I don't know Japanese, or these are the questions I'm asking myself right now.
It's really difficult.
But my question is probably the elephant in the room, because coming from an electronic literature background, the big question is, of course, to what extent are these forms, these culture specific forms, also experimental? In many areas they don't seem to be, like the Japanese internet novel. It would probably not be able to survive were it overly experimental, right? So they depend on genre, they depend on readers getting what they expect, right? So is this then still elite? Is it experimental, or is some of it, or are you just talking broadly about sort of fiction, how and how it can be digital born in different parts of the world, depending on their specific parameters, constraints, traditions, I guess. So that's what interests me.
Yeah, so this is a conversation that I've been having for a long time. And because this notion of literature is very imperialist. The whole notion of research and knowledge is very imperialist.
Right.
And in particular, it's particularly problematic in English language literary tradition, because the study of English literature was deliberately intended to maintain classism. It was intended to maintain the status quo of the aristocracy and the upper class, and to keep people in their place. So with that in mind, I try to approach it as we have experimental, we have avant-garde, and we have things that are popular or commercial. And I feel like who gets to decide whether something is part of a literary tradition shouldn't be restricted to, you know, academics or people deciding curricula or, you know, the powers that be, because we know it's problematic. We know it's highly problematic that, you know, most of us when we were in school only read fiction by old white men, you know. We know it's problematic because there's, you know, we're missing out on so much culture. I've part of my fascination with the oral storytelling and digital fiction is that I've been on a project recently looking at women-made science fiction films, and just looking at films that have been written and directed by women, particularly those that are outside the studio system, is really interesting to see how very different those narratives are in terms of structure and techniques. And so that's what we're missing out when we try to define something as worthy of study based on experimentalism or something like that. So on the electronic literature collection, you'll see that there's a lot more of this type of stuff included, of web novels, of blog fictions, of 360-degree films, because it was important to us to open our perspectives to cultures and peoples and languages that didn't have the same affordances and expectations as we did for literature. So colonialism stunted print literature in many places that were colonized, because it was expected that you create our literature. And then when they were permitted to you know, write their own stories, it was all they had was a base of post-colonialism and then its identity genres. So this is African literature, you know, and so that's also problematic. So I discussed this, I think, in my introduction. I just threw all that notion of what is and isn't literature out the window. And I embraced popularity as popular culture is the art of making do with what we're given and then speaking back to those structures. So we do things that Facebook doesn't want us to do. We create groups that they then zuck or delete because they're not right, you know, they're not according to the rules. And we make Twitter bots, and we you know, we do all these things. So even if they're on popular platforms and they're for popular purposes, we're still pushing back. Internet literature in China was pushing back as subtly as they could, as they were allowed to do. So even if we do wind up with a lot of narratives in certain genres or forms that are just, you know, they're commercial, they're, you know, churning them out for commercial purposes, there is still a role of those. We can still see great works emerging from them that affect culture and that affect the way people think. And we shouldn't eschew them just because we don't think that they're part of the avant-garde that's pushing the edge of the envelope.
Totally. They're part of what people do, make, read,
Exactly.
consume.
I mean,
so yeah.
Shakespeare was popular. I mean, he definitely wasn't writing so that he could you know, get 4 stars in a academic metric. He was writing for bums on seats.
Right.
So every time I start to worry about that, I'm like, nah, Shakespeare just wanted people, you know, to pay their pennies. And well, and if you've ever seen Comedy of Errors, you know that while he could produce Hamlet, he could also produce something really terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Lyle.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, it was.
Lyle, we have a question in the chat box. Could you please take a look at it from Katie Warren Morris?
Great. For the purposes of the recording, I'll read it a bit
Please do.
from Katie. I'll skip over the thank you so much and get to the question. So she's wanting to pursue interrogation of the concept of post-digital and wants to question about ethics in the context of co-produced social media narratives. How do we as practice-based researchers account for any of the potential participants / collaborators operating? That's right, I've got my dogs here and they're half feral. So how do we account for any of the potential participants / collaborators operating on social media platforms whom we rely on in order to activate / fully realize our work? We rely on their contribution / participation to realize our ideas, even when we can't predict what their contributions will be. And how do we account for this potentiality? I actually have written a little bit about this. This was something that I explored in my PhD thesis. I wasn't doing social media narratives, but I did sort of appropriate works that were in the commons, images, music, that sort of thing, to incorporate into my narratives. And they do change what you're working on. So those people do make contributions, even if you're not even if you're not consciously thinking about it, even if you're not intending for that to happen. And certainly when we're creating these collaborative narratives, that happens. And there are discussions in the literature about internet gift economies and that sort of exchange of cultural status through the creative things that we exchange in the commons online, and that we're sort of consenting by anything that we do online. There's this inherent consent to use what I've given you, to build on it, but it's very difficult in terms of saying what's mine and what's yours. We can't really do that, right? I think if you go into any writer's room, like television writer's room, and you ask who wrote that joke, well, you might be able to point to one person, but they thought of that joke because of what so-and-so said 3 hours ago, and it's now churning up, in their mind and that sort of thing. So collaborative processes are always really difficult to pull out. So what's interesting to me on that is not necessarily ownership, because we're definitely relinquishing. And I think this concept of ownership and copyright and who's done what is a print culture side effect, right? We didn't worry about ownership when it was oral narratives. We didn't worry, we borrowed like crazy, right? If you hear a really great joke from someone, you tell that joke to the next person that you meet, and you don't worry, oh, I got this joke from, you might say, oh, I got this joke from so and so, but on down the line, nobody cares. Nobody will know who wrote the original joke. And so it's that sort of collective building of a narrative that is really interesting. Now, as researchers accounting for the potentiality, you can't. And that's what's really exciting. I mean, sometimes you can't even account for potentiality if you're the sole creator, right? Writers talk about their characters taking off in different directions and being uncontrollable, right? And that's just our way of saying, well, I couldn't have predicted at the start that I would have this idea, or that I would want to take it this way, or that these things would emerge through the art. And so we just embrace it, and you look at it and see what it adds to the work, and see what it maybe limits, or see what it opens. And that for me is the interesting aspect. I don't want to explain it away or apply some imperialist notion of objectivity to it, that there's only one truth and that's mine. But I want to you wish your ethics board thought the same. Yeah, ethics boards can be tricky. If it's social media, I mean, I usually get around those things with a disclaimer or anonymization. I mean, if we're posting things on social media, they're published anyway. So there's that element. There's a lot written about the ethics of researching people themselves on social media, but in terms of their creative contributions, I think informed participation is good.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much, Katie, for the question. I'm afraid we're running out of time. So I need to cut this fascinating discussion here and finish it. So Lyle, again, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all of you who've been here with us on Zoom and in the classroom. Don't forget that on the 5th of May, Alice Bell is giving her talk at 1:15 p.m. Warsaw time, which is I think 12:15 in English time. So don't forget about that. I'm sure it will be great as well. So Lyle, again, thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.
Have a great weekend, all.
Yeah. Bye.